How do you tell the truth about a time and a place? This is the question that I've grappled with in writing New Art City. When I started work on this book more than a dozen years ago, I wanted to write a history of art and artists in mid-century New York that was true to the great variety of expressions that flourished back then. For it is all too often forgotten that the abstract expressionists were not the only artists who counted. Far from it. I wanted to write a history that would bring a wider range of artists together again into a broader picture, a truer picture. But the search for the truth of a period, for the big truth, if you will, has a way of setting many different kinds of truth on collision courses. When we look back at a time that has been characterized as the triumph of American painting, this time 50 or 60 years ago, we see artists who are clearly the victors, that in terms of reputation, in terms of the place they now have in the story, people like de Kooning, Pollock, and Warhol. And we also see artists who might be called victims, artists whose work is relatively little looked at and understood, people like the beautifully ascetic abstract painter Burgoyne Diller, or the mysteriously lyrical figure painter Earl Kirkham. Each of these artists, whether Pollock, a victor, or Kirkham, a victim, in my terms for the moment, who were, by the way, friends. These two artists were good friends. Each of these artists spins a world that has its own kind of artistic authenticity or truth. And these truths can sometimes seem to be in conflict, which is really as it should be in the world of art, where each artist creates a kingdom, a principality, a realm of his or her own. But that's only the beginning of the trouble, because the judgments that people make about these artists' works, both in their own time and later on, can become judgments about what qualities or values count and do not count, and what counts more or less in the art of a period, and in the art of the future, because past is also prologue. Some people at the time had different views of what was really happening, or of what really mattered. The writer who looks back must make judgments about those various judgments. There is no such thing as disinterested history, and the writer inevitably must have his or her own set of ideas, his or her own version of the truth, or at least some working definition of the truth, or some idea of how one discovers the truth or truths of a time. So here I'm looking at this period where some artists like de Kooning and Pollock are said to be, well, these are the key people, this is the mainstream. And then other artists who I find and people I know find interesting, they're put on the sides. Then you look, or today they're put on the sides. They're regarded, even if they're discussed, they're regarded as marginal figures. Okay? And some people say, well, yeah, that's the way it is, that's the truth. And then you look back at the 1950s and 60s, and you see other things being said. People who are now marginal, if noticed at all, are said at the time by certain people to be key, to be central. What do you do with all these assertions, all these different versions of the truth? And I spent, the first 5 or 6 years I was working on this book, I would have little bits of it. I would have 20 or 30 pages on Hans Hofmann, or 20 or 30 pages on this artist. And I kept moving them around, and I didn't know how to bring them together. And what finally began to happen was that after looking at details and reading anecdotes, stories about what people had said at the Artists Club or the Cedar Tavern, reading the many, many extraordinary critical writings done at the period that still are there to be seen in the back issues of art magazines of art, like Art News, accounts of the period by marvelous writers like Thomas Hess that have never been reprinted. You read these things and you look at the details of them, the details of how people regarded specific artists, and I also began to read a lot of accounts by poets and novelists. I looked at films of the period. Somebody was just mentioning to me earlier a source I use a lot in the book, Judith Malina, one of the founders of Living Theater. She wrote a journal which has been published in a thick volume, which is just packed with marvelous comments, anecdotes. She's at a Hans Hofmann opening, and Ms. Hoffman, Hoffman's wife, is saying, everything that's going on is just politics. Now, what is this? This is a comment in the 50s, somebody complaining about the sort of politicization of the art world through economics. And Melina recognizes this happening already in the 50s. So I start reading all these things. There are marvelous journals by Allen Ginsberg, which he talks about walking the streets of New York and the people he sees and the things he encountered. And so I'm looking at all these details. Of course, it's incredibly confusing. Like, where do you put this? Where do you put that? But sometimes when you look for a long time at all these details and the things people say, you begin to find behind this kind of noise of detail, this marvelous noise of detail, you begin to discern a pattern. And what I began to realize, and it was hard to realize because often what you were needing to see was not what people were saying, but sometimes what they were not saying. But what I began to realize there was that in mid-century New York, the explosion of creativity was buoyed up, was encouraged, was in fact supported by a wealth of very grand ideas about the nature of art and the nature of history, philosophic ideas of a largeness and an audacity that we tend to be more skeptical about today. When you started to read, you would find mentions of Nietzsche, and you would find people talking about the will. People argue about what does romantic mean. And there's a lot of talk in the 50s, drunken talk sometimes in the Cedar Tavern, where you might say words have capital letters. People talk about, there would be these arguments at the club where people would talk about, what's the difference between a pebble and a potato? And they would get in these discussions, which were actually discussions about the difference between classicism and romanticism. And at the same time, they liked to sort of swat at big ideas. You find Newman and Clifford Still in their writings saying, I hate Hegel, I hate Kant, I hate all that European philosophy. And I would read those things and think, oh, okay, all right, I should forget European philosophy. But after a while, I began to realize sometimes when people are protesting a lot, when somebody like de Kooning is saying, I'm tired of those big ideas about history, what that really means is that they're very conscious of all those big ideas.